Hello everyone, welcome to a Polytopia video. This video is going to be about Polaris late game and more in particular Polaris versus Polaris late game. This is a video that I've been planning to make for a very long time, to the point where the replay I'm going to be talking about now has actually expired as of about a week ago. Thankfully, I managed to record the replay right before it expired, and that's what I'm going to be showing on screen now. But this is actually already a replay that you can't open in game anymore. And because of that, this game is so old that it actually took place before the patch of the Ocean update. Now, thankfully, that does not make this replay outdated for the topic that I want to be talking about, because the topic of this video is going to be about Polaris versus Polaris late game, and Polaris was completely unchanged in the patch of the Ocean update, and also has been unchanged ever since. And so this video is currently going to be just as relevant regardless of how old the replay is. So because I now don't have the replay, the formatting of this video is going to be structured a little differently, but that's going to be the only abnormal thing. Now, in regards to the game itself, I am the white Polaris in the bottom corner, and the other player you should be looking at is the purple Polaris in the right corner. That is my ultimate opponent in the late game, and in general how this game plays out is we both effectively eliminate the person left of us. For me, that's the Kiku. For purple Polaris, that's the black Polaris. And after that, we more or less end up having about half of the map, except the black Polaris does actually have a few more cities, because there's a few more cities in the top side of the map in general. And yeah, me and the purple Polaris actually encounter each other pretty early in the game, and we sign peace with each other, and they break peace around the turn where I eliminate the Kiku. And from there, the game starts becoming pretty crazy. But yeah, as with a few of my previous videos, this game is a 900 tile, 4-player game. So I'm not even going to bother attempting to just play the whole thing and comment over every single turn that's happening, because this video is gonna end up being hours and hours. So just like normal, I'll end up playing most of the game up until the moment that I want to start actually talking about. So yeah, and one last thing. This video is just going to talk about a really cool late game matchup and how it played out. I'm not really going to be explaining Polaris in general in detail. Alright, so this is the turn where the enemy Polaris finally breaks peace with me. And the context is that I am just about to capture the final Kiku city and eliminate them. So they break peace with me here also, while they themselves actually have a bunch of units in that Kiku city at the same time, which means that they can break peace with me right now and not have them disappear. And at this stage in the game, this Polaris player is actually a decent bit ahead of me, but that is because they had gone for their ice bank earlier than what I had. And also because in general there's more cities on the top side of the map, but also because they have so far been more active in spending all of their stars to upgrade the cities and get their gummies out, which I haven't been doing as much, and thus I have 200 stars saved over. Now, at the same time, this purple Polaris still isn't able to throw their full force at me because they still have to clean up the black Polaris bot. And so I do actually end up getting a couple of turns to catch up. And I do that pretty manageably in that within the cities that have the most enemy units next to them, I start spamming ice fortresses in them and basically trying to fill up their population slots as quickly as possible. And that is successful in managing to expel all the units that they have very close to my cities and allowing me to establish a defensive line myself. At the same time, I do start spending my 200-ish stars to start maximizing the population I get from every single city in order to get as many gummies as possible. And just on the turn that they break peace, I believe I managed to get a gummy basically out of every single city I have. So over the over the next few turns, we do manage to catch up a decent amount, and the opponent does also manage to eliminate the Black Polaris bot, and we do end up establishing a line of gummies that just keep freezing each other. And from there, it's interesting how the game turns out. It's around turn 30 that the battlefield more or less evolves into just having a line of gummies and basically just keep simultaneously freezing each other. And around this time is the part where I find really interesting in what each of us actually decides to start chaining at our cities. Me seeing this battlefield, I keep chaining ice fortresses out of most of the cities because I think that ice fortresses, with the two range they have, can actually hit the gummies through the my side of the wall of gummies. And yeah, that's how they can start killing them off. What the opponent starts doing, and the way they try and break to the line, is they start throwing a bunch of knights at my gummies. But the problem is that in order to kill a gummy, you need three separate knight hits, which is not really an efficient deal at all. And it also is sometimes in this battlefield pretty unpractical because there's just not enough space around all of my units to really kill off that many gummies. And one other really key factor with the Ice Forges is that they also take three hits from a knight. Two knights are very, very slightly off of killing a single Ice Fortress, but yeah, because of that, if the opponent actually wants to kill an Ice Fortress, they have to waste as many knights on it as a Gami. And that is a definitely very inefficient deal since obviously the opponent has to trade 3 units for this one. Also, a single ice fortress actually costs less than 2 knights, and the opponent basically has to waste 3 sometimes, to just remove one. And Even though the ice fortress are way slower, and I'm not even sure if each of my ice fortresses fired one time on average, just with the amount of stats that they provide on the battlefield, actually makes them kind of more optimal to train. We'll see that in a couple of turns. Both of us, to be fair, do go for some other weird things that more or less don't work. For example, my opponent occasionally trains mindbenders to try and like convert frozen gummies on my side, which again completely doesn't work because I also chain plenty of knights. More than enough for me to chain through their mindbenders. And I also tried to train a couple of occasional cloaks, which did not manage to ever get to cloak one of my enemy cities. So they were more or less a waste of a unit. The sets were also useful originally at the start of the battlefield because they were a unit that could hit a frozen gummy and then just skedaddle away without leaving a fragile unit to be chained by the enemy's knights. Whereas if I was to throw my knights at the enemy's gummies, they could be chained by a single enemy knight. Still, though, the sleds did end up ultimately becoming also quite redundant later on in the battlefield, and I did also have to completely stop chaining them too. Another unit I occasionally trained, I did have two random catapults. The first one was actually literally trained back when I was fighting Kiku, and I trained the second one because I actually noticed that it was doing good work. Even though the catapults get obviously so completely hard countered by knights, because it had 3 range, it could attack the enemy's gummies from more than enough of a distance that enemy knights could not get next to it at all. Now, still at the same time, I couldn't really spam catapults because the knights would eventually likely break through. And yeah, I couldn't afford to just have a bunch of catapults being chained. My opponent does actually also have a couple of randomized fortresses, but most of them were either trained before they started fighting me or were mainly actually mind bendered from the enemy Polaris. But the dynamic basically remained the same. Each of us had a wall of gummies, and what the opponent was trying to do was spamming knights in order to try and break through my wall of gummies. And I was also chaining knights, but more in order to be able to react to the opponent's spammage of knights. And also, the main way I use knights was I would only ever finish off a gummy with them. And what I tried to train was ice fortresses that I would try and actually position to attack the gummies. The thing that I want to bring to your attention is very noticeable around turn 33. If you look at the amount of population that's used up in all of our cities, you're going to notice a pretty significant difference between mine and the enemy cities, and that most of my cities have almost all of their population fully used up. And that's because the way I trained units in that game largely was that I would chain solely ice fortresses, or at least catapults and things like that, units that are meant to last on the battlefield. I would train them until I had only one or two population left free on that city, and only in that case I would start chaining knights from those cities. And as soon as a good amount of units started missing from a certain city, I would start chaining ice fortresses in it again. And I was basically trying to keep the population at my cities as full as possible so that I had as many units on the map as possible. Now, on the opposing side, if you look at my enemy cities, they do have a lot of cities that do have most of the population up. And I'm not exactly sure on what is using up them. It may be just that those cities have a bunch of gummies that have not died yet. But if you look at most of their cities, a lot of them have like only about half of their population used up, or sometimes even less. They have some cities that barely house any units in them, and that's because most of the units that my opponent chains are knights, and the opponent more or less just trains knights out of every single city. And those knights are basically immediately thrown upon the front line, where obviously they hit once and then they will die. That's kind of more or less how knights are. And thus my enemy cities start just gradually having less and less population, as also their gamis start dying off slowly throughout the battle. And over the time, I am actually the one who has more units on the field, and thus my units start putting a pressure and pushing back theirs. The game finally ends with me getting a few massive chains on the enemy's battlefield. One of them literally manages to basically kill off every single one of their units around the city in the middle, and my knights literally siege their city that's directly attacking mine, which they can obviously siege, but they resign from that point. They basically lose. And I, to be fair, have also managed to like clear out most of their army in all of the other sides of the battlefield as well. And that's kind of what I wanted the point of this video to be. I believe that almost everyone can agree that knights are probably better units than ice fortresses. That doesn't really need any saying. Knights are the one unit that Polaris is actually most famous for being able to very easily utilize because of their ice mechanic and polarism, making ice basically be the same as roads, giving them just a very easy way to actually utilize knights. Knights are actually a very intrinsic and core part of Polaris's late game that they're very renowned for. And at the same time, Ice Fortresses are usually regarded as being a somewhat weak unit in the game. And they mostly are. They are decent, but they do just quite simply cost a bit too much for what they actually give you as a unit. The good thing about Ice Fortresses is that they're almost certainly the strongest unit that you can train from a city in the game. Back before the naval update, they were basically meant to be Polaris's version of a battleship. And yeah, pretty clearly, they cost 15 stars to create, so that's supposed to be a direct parallel to the battleship. And they more or less mimic the old battleship, which has 4 attack and 3 defense. There's a lot of other things that goes against them, and the reason why the ice fortresses are really not as good as a battleship. Yeah, the 20 HP ice fortresses really aren't actually as good as the old battleships ever were. And so, even though they're basically the strongest unit that you can actually chain out of a city, the fact that they cost 15 stars usually makes them not good enough to be chained. However, in Polaris late game, stars aren't an issue. Because of the Ice Bank, you get an almost endless amount of stars every turn. And we even see in this game, I literally wasn't even trying to spend my stars before I started properly fighting against the Polaris, because I didn't see the need to really get so many gamis out of my cities, and I was just saving them. And thus I ended up sitting on about 300 or so stars by the time I started fighting the Polaris, which is when I started upgrading my cities. So it's just Polaris late game is also probably the one point of the game where stars almost become non-sequential. At such a point in the game, it's not correct to think about how much stars something costs. It's rather correct to think about how much value are you going to get from something permanently. Because again, the ice bag give both of us enough stars to be able to make an ice fortress in every single one of our cities, and still have a decent amount of spending stars afterwards, which we can afford to get more gamis and stuff. And again, my opponent was not chaining ice fortresses, they were chaining knights, which is also why they were actually upgrading their cities more than me. They had more leftover stars to do that, and they were more keen on doing that, on just gaining a bunch of gamis. But again, the gamis you can get out of your cities are a limited resource. You can only upgrade your city so much. And the game doesn't even come to the point where both of us just gradually, eventually run out of gamis. Knights, in just the way they work, you throw them at the enemy's units, and they attack once. And however much value you can get from them is decided in that moment. And yeah, if a knight doesn't actually kill a bunch of units at once, which to be fair, again, a lot of times they do. A lot of times knights chain through 3 to 5 other units. That happens quite often. But there's only going to be so many chains on the field that you can do, and you don't necessarily need more than 2 or 3 nights in order to get those chains. And after that, just training a knight out of your every single city, all that gives you the ability to do is throw them at a single gami or at a single big unit in order to get that low enough to be killed by a knight. Which again, as I said, is very inefficient. In order for the opponent to kill a single ice fortress with knights, they have to waste 3, which is a very much a negative trait in terms of stars, no, obviously. Overall, both of our strategies did also result from the position of the game we were in. My opponent was the aggressor, and they were the ones who had already positioned a bunch of units around my cities when I was still behind them, and thus they started chaining knights to try and get as much of an immediate impact as possible. And of course, I was the person who had a bunch of my cities exposed with a lot of enemy units next to them, and thus I really wanted to start chaining a bunch of like tanky units that could just like put enough mass in the way to slow the enemy down. But even from that point, after the first few turns, the opponent very much could have had the chance to catch up to what I'm doing and really just do the same. But they didn't. I don't remember how many cities difference it was, but I'm pretty sure the difference was I had 11 cities and the opponent had 13 or 14, which, yeah, the opponent had 2 or 3 cities more than me, which again, in such a point in the game, and such kind amount of cities, the like 2 or 3 cities difference isn't a huge amount, but it certainly is like advantage to the opponent. The opponent is the stronger one in this position, like no doubts about it. And again, just from the amount of cities they actually have, let alone the fact that they were actually ahead of me in the game and had more units and were the aggressor when we started fighting. And yet, yeah, they still, by just only chaining knights out of all of their cities, I ended up winning out by spamming ice fortresses. And that's just what I really wanted this video to be about. Again, at the end of the day, knights are almost certainly a better unit than ice fortresses, and in most games are obviously the thing you should actually train instead of an ice fortress. But there is a point in the game where training ice fortress is a lot more important than training knights, and yeah, this is that point. And yeah, that's what I want this video to be about. In Polytopia, you can't just mindlessly spam the best unit and expect that to win. You have to think about strategies a bit more carefully. But anyways, that's all for now, so end the video.